Hi, and welcome everyone to this very special episode of Open Dialogue Live. My name is David Barclay. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Oceanography, and I'm also the host of the podcast and radio show Sciographies, which is on CKDU, where we ask the question, mostly of Dal faculty and researchers, why did they become a scientist and how do they figure out, what the research questions they want to ask are, and how do they end up in Halifax? And on today's episode, we're taping it live, so it's unscripted as always, but also unedited, so that could be interesting. And we're doing it as part of this Open Dialogue Live series. And we're going to begin with a conversation with our special guest, and then we're going to feature some questions by you. So throughout the episode, you can type your questions in somewhere on your screen, and they'll come my way eventually, and we'll relay them to our special guest. Our special guest being Dr. Kathryn Sullivan. So Dr. Sullivan has, ascended to space many times, walked in space, descended to the deepest part of the world's ocean, the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, and ascended the echelon of administrative science in the US as well, holding top positions in the National Atmospheric and Oceanographic, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association. But she also holds a PhD in geology from Dalhousie University. And remarkably, we have some footage of her convocation, of her walking across the stage and accepting her diploma from Henry Hicks. So I think we're going to show that now.
This is 27-year-old Kathryn D. Sullivan, receiving her PhD degree in geology from Dalhousie University, Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Kathryn Dwyer Sullivan in geology.
Kathryn Dwyer Sullivan, by the authority vested in me by the Senate of Dalhousie University, I admit you to the degree of Doctor of Philosophy with all the rights and privileges thereto pertaining, and I congratulate you. Dr. Sullivan leaves us to go to NASA, the U.S. Space Agency, to be one of the first women to enter the training course as an astronaut, and we wish you good success.
Born in Paterson, New Jersey, she's one of 35 astronaut candidates in training to become a mission specialist on the space shuttle. As such, Kathy would be responsible for the experiments carried into orbit. Does she see an expanding role for women?
So yeah, pretty amazing clip there, and really just the beginning of I think we can say a storied career that continues to this day. Yeah, so I have many questions for Kathy. First of all, what was your childhood like? Was it remarkable? What's the secret sauce?
Hi, David. It's hilarious seeing that clip again. Probably everyone on this broadcast is too young to remember that was the old Dalhousie rink, and it burnt down the night of that very ceremony. So never to be seen again. I had, I think, a very unremarkable childhood, really. My father was an aerospace engineer, and my mother a stay-at-home mom. We moved to Southern California when I was 6 years old from New Jersey. So that opened the way for me to have a much more adventurous childhood, I would say. We lived on the fringe of suburbia with open grassy hills all around our house, a rental stable where you could hire a horse for a couple of dollars an hour, an easy level for us to save our allowance to reach. So sort of, the great outdoors, less tightly jam-packed with people than where we had begun our lives in New Jersey. But other than that, it was a pretty conventional Southern California suburban life.
I mean, it is kind of interesting you got to move to California in the era of California, right? So this would be the early 60s, Gidget and the Beach Boys and all that.
Yeah.
And yeah, you said you grew up in San Fernando, or you were growing up in San Fernando Valley, sort of the suburbs of Los Angeles. So did you go to Los Angeles as well and experience the big city?
We did not go down there all that often. I think we probably made the one obligatory trip to look at City Hall. There were the occasional school trips to like the Shrine Auditorium for some concert or opera performance. Those were mostly memorable, especially the school trips, for the horrendously long bus ride, because we moved there in 1958. So a lot of this was before the era of freeways. If you wanted to go downtown, you went downtown on surface streets, which seemed a long 20 miles to a young kid. The freeways are just coming into play. Disneyland was even still a bit new. I do remember our first trip to Disneyland, again, all on surface streets. And there were still orange groves all around. It was surrounded by orange orchards at the time. You won't find a trace of an orange tree there now, of course. We also my family did not spend much time over on the beach, which was, a couple of mountain ranges away. But we were not very much beach people. We kind of followed my dad's interests, which quickly came to settle on fishing, and secondarily came to settle on flying small airplanes, because you could get to much better fishing grounds much faster in a small plane than in a car, but also to feed my brother's lifelong interest in flying.
Okay. Yeah, and Southern California is sort of the mecca of flying, because the weather's always good, right? You don't have to worry. Not too dangerous. Did you? And so, your father, was he the motivation for moving to California? Was it an aerospace job that brought him there?
Yeah, very much. I mean, the epicenter of aerospace was clearly moving westward, and a colleague of his from work had already shifted out to this small company that my dad started with, and kept urging my dad to make the move as well. And finally, in the early part of 1958, we did. Right.
And, you mentioned your mom was a stay-at-home mom, but I also read in one of your many biographies out there that she was worldly. That was the word that was used. And I guess my question is mostly aimed at the fact that when you went to college, you first thought you were going to study languages. So were you more interested in the arts and humanities as a high school student?
I was interested in finding a path that would take me to a life that was as inquisitive and adventurous as the ones I saw the early astronauts and Jacques Cousteau leading. It didn't bother me at all that the exemplars of that I was watching were all male. I looked underneath the gender and said, some people get to have this kind of adventurous, travel-laden, inquisitive life, and I want my life to have that kind of chemistry to it. Never entered my mind that this, men get to do this, women don't. These were people having this kind of life. I'm a people. I'm going to find a way to have this kind of life. It's interesting that someone described my mother as worldly. I think that's apt. She had an appetite as a young girl to go to one of the 4-year Seven Sisters colleges in the Eastern U.S. And for part of her teenage years, it looked like that was possible. But some very mysterious circumstance kind of late in her teen years resulted in her father enrolling her in a 2-year Catholic girls' school upstate New York. I think directly out of that experience, with her certificate in hand, she married my dad and off they went. So I think part of what I probably had infused in me by my mother was maybe a bit of her shock and disappointment that she had dreamed so big and not been able to pursue those dreams. And I think some of the stories she told me, and I think some of even the young little kid books she read me, had a bit of finger wagging of, don't you stop short of what your full potential is to it. So I think she started working on that wiring at a very young age.
Yeah. Like thinking back to those times, you went to college. Was there an expectation to go to college, or what are your memories of your parents' expectations as a high school student?
I think my parents' only expectations of my brother and I in school were you appreciate the value of education and where it can take you, and do good work. Don't slough things off. Try hard, and don't duck the things that are hard for you. You can get better at things that you're not naturally good at by working at them a bit. So don't duck or don't chicken out. But they were not ones to lay a job title or a presumption of career on either of us. My brother, as I said, from I think age 3 or 4, was mesmerized by airplanes. So it was pretty clear that that's the passion he wanted to pursue. And their attitude was, if that's your interest, we'll help you explore it, whatever it is. No one gets to edit whether you ought to have that interest or not. I, as I said, did not have a specific label to my interests. I had a much more nebulous desire in mind. And I aimed towards languages because at about age 10, a family friend pointed out to me and my parents that I have some natural flair for languages and picking up accents. And I made the simple equation that learning languages was a good way to probably somehow translate into people buying me airline tickets. So that was the strength that I was going to bank on to start with.
Yeah. I also was curious a little bit about your high school. So I did, look up William Taft High School, and really amazing alumni.
Yeah.
Some that coincided with you. Are you in contact with any high school people? I know this is a long time ago. This is a bit of a long shot question.
Yeah, it's a long time, and it was quite a huge school. My graduating class had over 1,000 people in it.
Wow.
So, with that large a year group, you're probably friends with 5 or 10, and you maybe know another 20 more, and the rest are just the faceless mass. I'm in touch with 3 of my high school gal pals, and probably could track down a few others if I tried real hard. But the ones I'm in touch with have all stayed. Well, most have stayed in California. One emigrated to Israel. We've just all been very scattered, and of course, I've been the archetypal vagabond ever since leaving high school.
Yeah, very interesting. Lots of professional athletes came out of your school. That seemed to be a thing. Not sure why.
Yeah. That probably postdates me. Back in my day, we always joked that we had a good chance of winning the Valley championships, especially in tennis. But if it came down to trying to win the Los Angeles championship in football, our football squad of funny little suburban white boys kind of looked like the debate team when you went downtown and played the big powerhouse schools. Yeah,
it seems like in your era, it was actually baseball. There were 3 professional baseball players ahead of you by 1 year.
That I can believe. Football, not so much.
Yeah, that was later on. You're right.
Yeah.
So then you became a banana slug. You decided to go to UC Santa Cruz. How did that decision? So college was sort of expected, I think, and or something you wanted to do. But how did you decide to go to Santa Cruz?
Yeah, it was not expected in the sense of thou shalt. It was expected in the sense of as a family project, both of you will have the ability to go to college. And I think if one or the other of us had opted out, I don't think there would have been any huge drama about it. This was in the olden days when one did not do 20 city tours to check out colleges and see if you liked the gym and is the climbing wall really good, and are the dorms to your satisfaction. I also had my eye on the University of Michigan because of the strength of their language programs. And a couple of factors that dissuaded me there were, the out-of-state tuition would have been, it was not as large then as it is now, but still would have been an extra hit on the family. And I read in the undergraduate catalog one day that freshmen were not allowed to have cars on campus. I took offense at the notion that I was being peremptorily banned from having a car. I didn't have one. I couldn't have afforded one. I just resented the notion that someone was being so, frivolous in this decree. I didn't realize it was all about managing the parking situation in Ann Arbor. So I took personal offense at that. But more importantly, we had a chance to visit Santa Cruz, and I loved the campus, the feel of the place, the natural environment of the place, and all the people I met there. It was maybe I would have felt just as at home if I'd had a chance to also visit Michigan. I can't make that comparison, but it felt really good at Santa Cruz. A little known story is after I filled out the application and sent it off, and one day in the mail, I got the dreaded skinny envelope that said, "We're very sorry, but we don't have room for you at Santa Cruz." And of course, I spent the afternoon and evening being crushed. But then I sat down and wrote a letter myself, typed it up myself, back to the admissions office, telling them how disappointed I was that I'd been to the campus. It felt really right. And asking, could they tell me on what grounds I was not competitive? Did they have a second round of consideration? And if they did, would they look at me again? And failing all of that, since there were 6 other campuses in the University of California system at the time, if you got bumped out of one, they would route your application to others for consideration. So that was my final recourse. If all else fails, send my file over here, please. And a few weeks elapse, and then I get the fat envelope admitting me joyfully to Santa Cruz. And of course, I then spent the rest of the entire summer wondering and worrying about what if they were right at the first in the first place, and I can't hack it at Santa Cruz.
So did you hack it?
I managed to hack it, and I actually managed to change majors at the end of my freshman year from the language track I started on to the earth sciences track, which I discovered because I was forced to take some natural science classes. And young professors really at a dynamic point in their career, very engaging and gregarious, taking us out to the shore or up into the mountains every weekend to, do the doing of geology and marine biology for real, not just talk about it, not just make it a vocabulary test. And I loved that. It was a miniature version of that adventurous and inquisitive life I'd kind of been longing for since the early space days. So I finally worked up the courage to ask my oceanography prof. I had no intelligent questions at this point. It was still this very vague wondering and longing. And we're good friends to this day. And we tease about the fact that I essentially went up to him and said, I've been really interested in this class and this other one. I'm not entirely sure why and what it means. What do you guys do? What does be an oceanographer mean other than lecture to freshmen in a lecture hall? What would it mean to be an oceanographer? And happily, I picked the right guy. He didn't insult me and send me back to the French department. He sort of welcomed my question.
Yeah. Did you get a chance to do some research as well when you were an undergrad outside of the class?
I got a little dose of research in my senior year. One of my professors brokered an arrangement for me to join a U.S. Geological Survey seismic cruise, mapping the offshore borderlands of Southern California. And the goal was to trace the offshore extension of faults that were known on Earth and see what kind of try to get a handle on what sort of seismic hazard might exist in the offshore faults that would be complementary to the hazard you might estimate from the onshore extension of that fault.
Mm-hmm. And that pretty much was it in terms of graduate school. I mean, you kind of stuck with the topic, stuck with the work, and how did you end up, deciding to come to Dal and move to Halifax, the other end of the continent?
Yeah. Well, you have to reach 1 year earlier than those senior year cruises for the setup of that story. Okay. I had not entirely given up on my interest in languages and travel, and so I jumped at the chance to do a junior year abroad, and I moved to Bergen, Norway in June of 1971, it would have been, and stayed there until September of 72. And if you look back at the history of geology, these are sort of pivotal years in which the notion of plate tectonics is really coming to the foreground, to the front of the stage. It's gaining the spotlight. And so those research papers were just hitting the open literature. At universities in Norway, undergrads don't usually spend any time in the research libraries. They're just doing a more rote kind of curriculum. But with my Santa Cruz background, I was in the research library all the time and just devouring these papers. And of course, a lot of the kind of geology that had led to the deciphering of plate tectonics was really pertinent to the continental margin of Norway. So, this was happening on my doorstep during my junior year. I'm watching it in the news. I'm hearing my professors sort of rip up their old ideas about how the continental margin of Norway formed, and the early glimmers in Norwegian scientific and government circles of there might be oil and gas offshore that could change the economy of this country. All that was happening. And one of the groups that was publishing prolifically about seafloor spreading in the mid-Atlantic ridges was the Charlotte and Mike Keene group out of both Dalhousie and Fab Aumento, Dalhousie and Bedford Institute. Right. So I'd read a lot of their papers. The North Atlantic was becoming a real favorite region of mine. And when I went back to grad school, Santa Cruz, I talked to the same advisor that got me out to sea senior year, who was a marine geophysicist, and said, who are these guys in Canada? Are they, what about them? Their papers seem pretty good. The work seems pretty solid. What do you know about them? It would be an interesting place to go live for 4 or 5 years. And I think I want to work in the North Atlantic. So that's how I ended up there.
Okay. Yeah. And I was reading that Charlotte Green was the first woman to go on a seismic cruise in Canada.
Charlotte Keene. Yeah, probably true. Yeah. And I suspect she was probably also the first woman to lead a cruise as chief scientist, because this was back in the good old days when, how many women could you have aboard the ship? Only as many as you had cabins with shared bathrooms, because there might be 15 other bathrooms aboard the ship, but they should certainly only use this one that was between the two cabins. It was pretty nonsensical.
Yeah, and apparently she snuck on the cruise.
I wouldn't doubt that. That's Charlotte's style. Yeah.
So did you find a kindred spirit when you came and were working with her?
Yeah, very much. There were some really fine folks there, and Charlotte and I really hit it off. And at the end of it all, she became my primary supervisor. Mike Keene had shifted from Dal over to Bedford, and various other shifts in what everybody was doing. So Charlotte really ended up being my main advisor. And just, I think, a couple of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I was up in Nova Scotia again and joined up with Charlotte. We went back over to Bedford Institute. The good old ship that we knew as the CSS Hudson was back in port. She's now Canadian Coast Guard, of course, but she's still the Hudson, and she's a little older than when I was aboard her. But Charlotte and I with the skipper's permission, we did a great nostalgia tour, walking through the passageways and the laboratories and seeing what was the same and seeing what was different. Still
very much in use, and I'm actually in the life sciences building, which would have been built right before you arrived. Did you have offices in the?
I was in the oceanography wing of the life science building. Yep.
Which floor?
3rd.
Okay, I'm on the 5th. Sorry, I thought we were gonna have a moment there, but close.
My office was on the flanks of Jim Hall's lab.
Okay. So you had some pretty, your thesis, you had a couple of really well-cited papers that came out of that about the Newfoundland Basin. And this story of telling, sort of like 10 years, which is, 1 second in science, academia time, right, of the birth of plate tectonics. And, but you walked off that stage and you became an astronaut. So was that a difficult thing to leave all the training behind, or what was the overlaps in your training and your new job?
I think the overlaps were considerable, and they lie in the area of expedition planning and expedition operations. I mean, if you're gonna, all of my work was blue water oceanography, quite far offshore. So you've got a set of scientific objectives. It's up to you to figure out what kind of equipment do you need to get the measurements and the data that you need to think about the what ifs, spare parts and backups and alternative plans. And then you get underway. And of course, Mother Nature doesn't deliver you, events never turn out the way the precepts of your plan presumed. So you're always having to replan and adapt and adjust. And that's, other than the fact that that happens at sea at speeds of 10 to 12 knots, and it happens in orbit at 17,500 miles an hour, but it's the same stuff, right? What's your plan to get something done, and what are the alternatives, and how well have you mastered the knowledge of the ship, of your equipment, of your gear? How fluently can you shift gears when things don't go the way you had forecast? That's really what it's all about. And I kind of knew it was not entirely an easy thing to say. If you go this route, and if you succeed at getting selected, and that was actually part of what made it easy to apply. The odds were so against you being selected that you might as well apply. On the odd chance that you get selected, it might mean that you never go out to sea again on a research cruise. And are you really okay with that? Let's look at what alternatives, what upsides you'll get on the new road. And you just have to think through for yourself, do those balance out in a way that satisfies you? And the kicker, or the pivot factor for me, was if I manage to get selected despite the long odds, I'll get to see the Earth from orbit with my own eyes. And I felt that outweighed a lot of things. That was just, as someone who's been fascinated by maps and by the Earth from a very, very, very young age, notwithstanding my detour into languages. My interest in maps and geography goes much further back in my past than that. And you'd actually get to look out a window or the visor of a spacesuit and see the planet yourself. I'm going to go for that.
Right, the ultimate plane ticket purchased for you. Yeah.
Now I never did manage to get the mileage credit, which is really too bad.
Yeah, I was reading some of the papers that collectively the missions, I guess the astronauts on the missions would write, and these beautiful papers just describing. It seemed like looking was such an important part of your work.
Yeah.
You were up there. For instance, right after the war in Iraq, looking at the oil in the Gulf of Oman, and just amazing observations.
Both of 2 out of 3 of my space flights were Earth science research missions. One more about remote sensing methodologies, and one about upper atmospheric chemistry and physics. But every space flight, including astronauts aboard the space station today, NASA has a formal link with the Smithsonian Institution here in the United States, which runs a global network called the Smithsonian Active Event Alert Network. And so researchers and officials around the world can feed into this network requests for astronaut observations, quick response astronaut observations of post-earthquake or a storm that's brewing or a volcanic eruption. So I had both 2 really Earth-intensive research missions, but on every one of the missions, you're very keyed into those kind of phenomena. And then, oh, by the way, it is one of the top 2 pastimes in orbit. The other one is playing with your food in zero gravity, but looking at the Earth is the one that endlessly fascinates everybody.
Yeah. One of the differences I was surprised to read about between seagoing mission and space mission is that you guys didn't work 24 hours, right? You didn't do shift work. You all collectively had slept. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the wake-up calls.
Yeah, so that varied from flight to flight. Mm-hmm. In the shuttle era, many flights were single shift. Everyone would bed down. Mission control would take over the monitoring function, and on those flights, you would have a distinct moment at a certain time of day when the whole crew was going to get woken up. On other flights, my atmospheric flight and other space lab flights, we did split the crew into shifts and work alternating shifts. And so you didn't do a wake-up call in the same way on those flights. Wake-up calls are one of the sort of fun games among astronauts who serve in mission control as the Capcom. Again, back in the shuttle day, that was the only person that spoke directly to the crew, would be the astronaut who was in the mission control center on the ground, as their eyes and their ears and their proxy, and more able to think about what's on their mind, what information do they need next, and help ensure that the ground team be responsive to that. On the first shuttle flight after the Challenger accident, I was one of those Capcoms, and I was working the shift whose job was to replan events overnight, send up the new plan in the morning, and wake the crew up. And so picking the wake up music was sort of, you could get style points for picking really clever or funny wake up music. And I was feeling pretty jubilant that we were going to get back to flying again after 2.5 years of being grounded. And so I went out I managed to get through to Robin Williams through his agent. This was not long after his famous film, Good Morning Vietnam, where he had that famous long yell, Good Morning Vietnam. So he taped about 10 versions of Good Morning Discovery for me that were done in the same vein. Probably 7 of them were so racy that I would have gotten fired if I played them, but the other 3 were really good. And then I got a couple of local guys that were clever at writing advertising jingles, and they wrote very, very clever, like right on point, space idiomatic lyrics to Beach Boys and Beatles tunes. And we played those as the wake up songs.
Yeah. I heard a few on your website. They were very entertaining.
Yeah. They are on my website. Yep.
Yeah. So I want to shift gears a little bit. So I guess once you become an astronaut, you pull off a couple, 3 successful missions, more or less. You pretty much do anything after that, I'm guessing, right? And somehow you became the top of NOAA, various top positions, and ultimately the top administrator and the Undersecretary of Commerce. And I was just wondering if you were appointed by Obama. I was just wondering if you could just tell us a quick story just about meeting him for the first time, or just to relax us for like 30 seconds,
Oh dear. That was my second stint at NOAA. I went there first as the chief scientist in the early 90s. And I've had Senate confirmed positions under every president since Ronald Reagan. The only one I didn't actually meet in person was George Bush II. Yeah, President Obama, I would see him, I would brief him a couple times a year in different settings. Usually a presidential briefing, if it's not high national security, we'll usually have a couple of dozen people in a room. And he'd come around, he would shake hands with everyone in the room, both at the the principal's table and on the back benches. And, a president meets a gazillion people per week. I'm not one that would expect he would necessarily remember my name, even if his briefing book for the day was really spot on. Yeah. Undersecretary is a pretty lofty title, but cabinet secretaries are the ones he sees with some regularity. And so as he would come to me, I would always say, good afternoon, Mr. President, Kathy Sullivan from NOAA, great to see you again. And like the second time I briefed him, I'm walking into that, he says, I know who you are, and he throws his arms around me and gives me a great big hug. I got to meet the First Lady once or twice, and got to meet the first dogs several times, and that's another treat as well.
Sounds great. Thanks for that. Just a little escapism for a moment there. So I had a question about that position. This seems like to me a very different experience, and going back to this idea of what ifs. You really excelled in what ifs, to go out to sea, have everything work, to go up in space, have everything work and adapt.
Yeah. How
is it different being, at the head of this large agency? And it seems to me like you'd be dealing more with crises than what ifs, or is there an overlap there in leadership style?
I think a lot depends on how the individual in those positions defines the job, because you do have some latitude to set your approach to it. NOAA's about, between contractors and federal direct employees, it's about 20,000 people. And it does everything from, it's a combination of basically Environment Canada and DFO and parts of NSERC, all rolled into one, sort of everything centered around ocean, atmosphere, fisheries, climate, coastal zones. It's got a very operational bent to it. The daily weather forecast, regular fisheries, stock assessments and things like that. And my philosophy of being the leader was to be sure that there are some good review processes and information processes that feed information and data to me, so I can confirm if we're running the ship correctly, we're on course, on target, doing the things we said we would do, managing the resources we've been given well. But I'm a real fan of thinking about in whatever seat you have, especially as you become more senior in an organization, there are certain things, certain questions, certain priorities, certain objectives that only the person who holds that office can pursue. And if you're not engaged in them or pursuing them, they're not happening. There are thousands of people in NOAA who can audit results and collect data and look at a tactical level about whether a given program or a given project has been run successfully. Do they really need me from the administrator's chair stepping in and saying, I want to do that too? And my take was, the better, more valuable thing to do from the administrator's chair is to help the senior leaders of NOAA look down the road, look around the corner, and set a direction that is more worthwhile than just surviving the day-to-day tactical skirmishes. Mm-hmm. And then think about how will we pursue those? What technical avenues? What hiring? What political arguments, because you have to make your case to the White House to get some new initiative in a budget, then you have to make your case to the Congress to get it funded. So what are we have a reason to believe we should try to move in this direction. It's important for the country. It's in furtherance of NOAA's mission. What are our strategies for getting there? And then how do each of us on that senior leadership team sort of harness up and help advance those strategies? So that was how I looked at it. So I was much more an up and out person. There certainly were plenty of crises and skirmishes that you had to get in the middle of, partly because they rose to my level, partly because some other influential figure was upset about them and only wanted to deal with me, even though someone 5 levels below me probably could have solved the problem. Right. But if you you've got to fight back the things that are trying to eat up the time and take it away from where you want to put it. And the best way I know to do that is build a really strong team around you. And back to my example of, the bigwig wants to deal with me, but if I've deputized you to handle that issue, I'm not going to fold and right away say, well, okay, you get me instead of David. I'm going to say, you've got my attention and David's my guy. He'll fix it.
So a very collaborative approach. Yeah, it sounds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But collaborative, I look at it more as a force multiplier approach. Sure. If everything has to flow through me, the organization is single threaded and can only advance at the rate that I can process things. That's idiotic. And it's just not true that every good idea that no one needs sits between these two ears. So I'm always learning. I want to hear from other people, not just to be nice, not just to be collaborative, but because that's the best prospect of getting really good ideas and really good strategies to move the organization forward in the best possible way. We're not we were not Pollyannish, and we were not soft on what are our expectations and what are our performance expectations, and not ducking when someone needs to hear some tough news that something didn't go right, and that that's on you. So force collaborative, creative, and force multiplier is not synonymous with wimpy or weak or underperforming. In fact, exactly the opposite. Right.
Yeah. I just want to take, as we kind of near the end here, a minute to shift gears completely. And I need to ask you about the Challenger Deep. Did you get cold called by Victor Vescovo to go? Did he just email you out of the blue?
Basically, yes. I had an email from a mutual colleague of ours, Don Walsh, who piloted Trieste to the Challenger Deep in 1960. I had a sort of heads up email from Don that Victor was thinking along these lines and was thinking I was the right person, the right woman to take along on this great dive. So stand by, I think you'll hear from him. But otherwise, it was an out of the blue, totally cold call.
And what was your reaction?
Well, my first reaction was, yes, of course.
Right.
And my second reaction was to call Don Walsh right back and say, tell me about these guys, tell me about the sub and its design. Is it well built? They got the handling system down right? Are they, it's no small deal to put a little tiny submarine. It's like putting an Easter egg into a washing machine to put a submersible into the water and get it back out again. You can bang it around pretty bad. You can damage it pretty bad. So I want to be sure that I asked a couple people I know who are deep into deep sea system design and engineering if this was all not only on the up and up and well designed and built, but being operated wisely by Victor and his team.
Right.
It's entirely personally owned vessel, personally owned submarine, and personally funded team. But Victor's a very savvy, sharp guy. No scientific background, but a very strong quantitative and mathematical background. Also did a long stint in the United States Navy as an intelligence officer. So, he knows what he's about, and he doesn't cut corners either. But before I hop in a little egg with him and go 36,000 feet down, I wanted to be sure I did my due diligence.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as an oceanographer, we're always talking about, to go to the bottom Mariana Trench is 1,100 atmospheres, and to go to space is one, right? So it's slightly more difficult, but
it's a whole lot harder.
Yeah. In terms of the personal feeling of sitting in the capsule, or let's call it the limiting factor, is that the name of the stuff, right?
Yep.
Versus, say, sitting in the space shuttle, was there comparative butterflies? Thinking about that comparison between the number of D bars you're about to undergo.
I didn't have many butterflies. I mean, by the time I got out on the ship and aboard, Victor personally had dived the Challenger Deep 8 times. The sub was on its 50th dive. I had inquired about the test and inspection regime. How often does it have to get stripped down and taken a look at? Because the fact that it did 50 times doesn't mean that something can't go badly wrong on 51. But it had a track record, had a good inspection record. I'm with a pilot that knows what he's about and has been to this environment several times. So I didn't have any real particular butterflies about it. I mean, you think about it, you're basically sensible about it. You know, let your family know where you're going. There's always that outside chance that something doesn't go the way you're thinking. But I was just, if anything, just like on my space flights, you've got an announced launch time, and if everything goes right, you'll end up in orbit and have a 10-day mission. But any number of things can cut the mission short. And any number of things on a submersible dive could mean that you don't make it to the bottom. Something, a minor leak in the hatch, and you'll abort within 20 meters of the surface. So, you know, it's always that more of eager anticipation, or, you know, suspenseful anticipation about, you know, will we make it to the bottom? Will something crop up that causes us to have to abort the dive? Yeah, I'm a pilot myself, so plenty of times I've canceled a flight or aborted a mission, and you do the right thing at the time, and you can go moan about it at the bar afterwards, but you got to make the right call at the time.
So otherwise it's just trusting the instruments and trusting the routine.
Trusting the engineering, really, and the redundancy and the safety systems that are built into the sub were all, you know, well thought out and you know, biased in the right direction. They're all biased in the direction of, when in doubt, go up.
And so when you got to the bottom, it takes about 4 hours to get to the bottom, total darkness most of the time.
Right.
Were you just a little bit disappointed that you couldn't go on a walk out in the trench?
No, because I understand what 16,000 PSI is too. So I was really, really happy that all of the hull penetrators seal, you know, inward, and the sphere was perfectly tight. And, you know, but one of the things that's in common for me to the space experience and the deep sea experience, and it's kind of a magical feeling to me to be sitting. I mean, I was sitting inside the submersible, essentially dressed like I'm dressed here, except by the time we got to the bottom, I'd put on hand warmers and a ski cap and a neck gaiter, because, you know, the cold is seeping into the sphere. But basically dressed like you're dressed here, and looking through this nice little viewport at this sort of exotic, intriguing moonscape with these little billows of sediment that we had stirred up. And this sort of magical feeling of feeling so normal where you're sitting, being like richly aware how exotic and how lethal the environment right outside that window is, and how bizarre it is to be able to be in that environment, you know, so close to not physically in contact with it, but so close to in contact with it, you know, that much viewport. And I always felt the same on the spacecraft. It's sort of intriguing to feel so normal sitting where you are and look through a window and see a sight that is so extraordinarily not normal, not every day. It's you know, it's a magic school bus kind of experience.
Well, that is yeah, amazing. I need to thank you for answering. I could ask you many more questions, but I know that I need to turn it over to some of our viewers and get their input, because otherwise we're going to go on forever here. So, so I think I should be able to see some viewer questions. Let's see. Okay, here we go. We have a question from Kathy J. Campbell. Being a sport medical doctor and a big exercise specialist, I remember seeing you, I believe, around the old gym. I think you did rowing. Wow. How important was fitness and exercise to you as you prepared for your career in life?
Yeah, I did row. I was a group of us that started women's competitive crew at Dalhousie way back when, with a clunky old boat that probably been hanging around the shed for a couple of decades before we showed up. And then you might have seen me bashing around the racquetball courts back when. You know, it's an important factor, in particular in the astronaut corps, and for two reasons. The primary one really is it takes a tremendous level of fitness just to maintain the pace of the training regimen. There's a lot going on all the time, and its second factor is you're wise to have a high level of fitness before you go into zero gravity, because it's the longer you stay in zero gravity, both muscles and bones begin to atrophy. On the 5 to 10 day missions that I did, an exercise period was scripted in for each of us each day, but it was really not as essential that you make sure you did it as it is now for astronauts that are spending 6 months on the space station. It's really critical for them to spend several hours a day doing the kind of conditioning that keeps their heart, their muscles, and their bones ready to come back to the Earth environment. So I mean, I've kind of always been a tomboy and a sports fan anyway. So except for as we all have bouts of great laziness in my life where I slough off the gym routine, I've pretty well been a pretty serious gym rat my whole life.
Okay. Let's see the next question from Joel Richard. What are Dr. Sullivan's thoughts on a personnel mission to Mars?
We should do one. And my reasoning's based on my sense of what Apollo did in the big scheme of things. When President Kennedy set that goal back in the early 1960s, NASA hardly existed. It didn't have enough people to take it on. It didn't have the technologies that would be necessary. It didn't have the knowledge that would be necessary. Didn't have the rockets or the computers. It hadn't ever given really any serious thought to how to monitor the health of human beings far away from the Earth. And if I look back at the broad range and variety of scientific and technological breakthroughs that were necessary to put men on the moon and bring them home under Apollo, it's an immense cascade of benefits that have really shaped the life that I have led and that we've all led. And I firmly believe that if we set the goal of sending humans to Mars and bringing them back, it is well beyond what we know how to do right now. I know that. I can probably list the key barriers as well as several people on the call. But instead of saying, well, that means we can't do it, let's say, well, that means we not need to solve them. And I guarantee you the cascade of benefits that would flow back to life here on Earth would be order of magnitude richer than Apollo. And let me cite just two that Apollo absolutely played a central role in catalyzing. One is few people appreciate Apollo marks the point in time when people stopped bragging about how big their computers were and began to brag about how small they were. Right. The computational demands for Apollo were kind of beyond what anyone had ever packaged in a small computer. The weight and volume demands were extraordinary, and the reliability demands were wildly crazy for the time. And the acceleration of that, which intersected with industries just having figured out the first steps of microcircuit design, Apollo was the accelerant that was poured on that and helped really launch the computer age that we know. And telemedicine, I would say, is another one. I need really small electrodes. I need small signal levels. I need precision sensors. I got to be sure this guy's heart is still beating when he's 240,000 miles away. How do I do that? If you get picked up by an ambulance today, your vitals will be telemetered to the hospital while you're en route to speed up care when you get there. And that has improved survival rates in emergency situations tremendously.
Okay, next question here is coming up from Nora Wellen. As such an accomplished human, what's your take on feelings of imposter syndrome?
I have them. I've had to wrestle with them through the course of my life. I'm not completely immune to them even today. My theory is that all humans have them, but men by and large are better at masking or not admitting them. And women by and large take them far more seriously than they should. So my advice to any women out there who have that little voice in their head with all these doubts and worries is give that voice a name. I, way back when, called that voice in my head Mrs. Snidely, and determined Mrs. Snidely never had anything good to say. And as long as I didn't quit, it usually turned out that Mrs. Snidely had been dead wrong. So, give your little voice a name and tell her to shut up.
That's great advice. I am shocked to hear that you would have imposter syndrome and yet go to space. 100% reliability. It just seems like those are two different things to manage.
To the degree that imposter syndrome means I threw my hat in the ring to go to Santa Cruz, and when I got accepted, I had these moments of wondering, can I really do that? I think if you're really reaching and trying and striving or sort of challenging yourself, I think you should expect to have some moments of saying, oh, wow, that is big. Oh, boy, can I really do that? I promise you, all of the NASA people that listened to Kennedy's speech at Rice University in 1961, who said, we're going to the moon, 10 years, their first reaction was yes, and the very next reaction was, holy cow, do any of us actually know how to do this? So, that's a little dose of the imposter syndrome. The pivotal point is whether the next thing you do is say, oh, I want out, or, oh, let's figure this out.
Right. And I guess when you're in space, you don't really have a choice. If you're
once you're there, you have no choice.
So
if you're along as a passenger, you can go cower under the instrument panel somewhere. But if you're a crew member, you have to be part of the solution.
Right. Okay, I think we have another question coming on the screen here from Amanda Paris. Did Dr. Sullivan ever feel like she was affecting the acceptance of females in sciences, especially females in geosciences? And some context here, Amanda received her BSc in 06 in Earth Sciences, and I'm thankful for what she's accomplished in terms of females in STEM. When I graduated, Earth Science was still male dominated, but we're closing the gap.
Well, I hope I did, and I hope both in the sense of serving as an example that in some ways inspired young girls. And as I said, when I was looking at the figures that inspired me as a young girl, they were the Alan Shepards and the Neil Armstrongs and the Ed Whites and the Jacques Cousteaus. I think I'm lucky, thanks to my parents' influence, and maybe a little bit weird, that it didn't bother me or deter me that all these inspiring figures were male and I was not. But it certainly helps, I think, to be able to, for any of us, to see someone who's more like you doing something is a easier boost to your confidence that you too can do that. But I would hope also that on the other side of the equation, perhaps the way I've worked, my accomplishments, my character and accomplishments have maybe shifted some minds on the male side of the equation as well. That this can work. This is a real human being. This is a straightaway human being. This is a peer. This is not a lesser. This is not. We can do this.
Yeah.
I guess I was wrong.
Right. Okay, we have one last question from a listener. From King Tufi. What is the best advice you can give to young students and graduates?
Well, to very young students, like still in primary or secondary school, I often encourage them to, especially if there's someone who said they dream of being an astronaut someday, I try to persuade them that the first thing they could do, they could start right now by regarding every single day in school as one of the days of their astronaut training, and taking it on as if it was the most valuable day in their astronaut training, not copping out because you don't like the teacher, and not copping out because the subject seems kind of hard. But this is a day I need to learn as much as I can because it goes in my bucket, and it adds up to the things the skills and knowledge that will let me become an astronaut someday. For young students, young graduates, I'd come back to a couple things we've touched on along the way. One is no one gets to edit your interests or the goals that you want to set for yourself. They're yours. You may well meet people who think it's weird for someone like you to have those goals, and you may well meet people who voice that opinion really loudly. But an opinion is nothing more than a puff of air unless you give it some force. So, the loudmouths will be out there. They're the guys in the peanut gallery. Don't let them have any bearing on what you do or how you do it, unless you're getting feedback from someone you have a reason to trust or respect. That input could be worth thinking about. So don't let anyone edit what you think you want to do. Understand you're going to have to back up. You got to back up big dreams with hard work and a fair amount of grit to turn them into the concrete stuff of reality. Otherwise, they're just wonderful daydreams. And we need people who will aim for the stars, aim a bit beyond what they think they can reach in all walks of life. And in particular, we need people that, whether they end up in agency administration or the law or elected office or heads of corporations, we need more people that have a really solid grasp of science and engineering and technology, right. And the reasoning and logic and clarity that those fields can bring to important matters in our daily life.
Yeah, and I think maybe I just can piggyback onto that question with a question of my own. For what you can tell well, professors and researchers and scientists, and as well as I think students as well, about scientific knowledge and scientific communication. So John Glenn famously said that you were not just an ivory tower scientist. And clearly, you've done an amazing job today of communicating your experiences, and it's just, you're an inspiring person to listen to very naturally. And so I'm wondering what you can tell us in our efforts to communicate science and to kind of beat down that notion of elitism in science and technology and engineering. Is there a secret there that we should know?
To me, the thing has always been, I'm not someone that wants to show people how much different and better I am than they are. Just like that professor, my freshman professor, who had this, blank, dumb-looking 17-year-old freshman French major standing in front of him, asking, "What do oceanographers do?" I mean, what an idiotic question to ask. And I think many professors would have sneered at me and figuratively, dismissed me, slapped me back to the French department, little girl. I'm far superior to you. You couldn't begin to come to where I am. Gary Griggs didn't do that. Gary Griggs responded to the passionate, the sincere question that was underneath my silly words, and respected the curiosity and respected the interest. And he met me where I was. And he did not consider that dumbing down, and he did not consider that to be abasing himself. He considered that reaching someone where they were and helping them connect with their future and with the sciences that he was passionately involved in. And so that's kind of always been the essence to me. It's not hard to make someone else feel less than you if you've got big vocabulary and fancy degrees. But it's a much greater gift to help them know you have something in common and you're happy to, share what you can with them. Speaking, explaining the things that we understand scientifically in plain English rather than journal-approved language is not being dumb. It's proving you're so fluent in the matter that you can explain it from any number of angles, not just the one that will pass muster in Earth and Planetary Science letters or the Journal of Geophysical Research.
Great. Okay. That's very useful advice. Well, I think I need to thank you for our hour. That was really wonderful. And thanks for spending some time with us and answering everyone's questions for now. And we can all learn so much more from you. Of course, you've written a book recently, so that's
Handprints on Hubble has some of the other fun stories that we didn't touch on.
Yeah, and I will say to our viewers, the rest of that video of you walking across the stage, there's actually a great after scene of you sailing in the Northwest Arm, or maybe the Bedford Basin. It's kind of unclear, but
it's the Arm.
It's the Arm. Okay, yeah, pretty amazing footage there. So if you want to learn a little bit more right away, go check that out. And yeah, thanks to everyone for viewing and joining the discussion. And we'll see you again.
The people you want to feel sorry for are the poor NASA television or video crew that had to be on the other sailboat on a really choppy, nasty day on the Northwest Arm.
You guys
looking through a camera viewfinder trying to film all this. They did not have a fun day.
Oh man, yeah, you guys were in full sou'wester rain gear.
Oh yeah, yeah. It was winter. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. We'll hopefully we have to talk to you again soon. Hopefully come visit us when all this is over here in Nova Scotia.
I look forward to that. Thanks to everybody for joining.
Yeah. All right.